The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series on the American Bicentennial. In honor of America's 200th anniversary, the AEI has invited many of the nation's leading scholars to share with us their views on the American Revolution, its goals and results, and how it still affects all of us today. The AEI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institution located in Washington, D.C. One of its goals is to promote public discussion of the major issues of our time. The Distinguished Lecture Series is a major part of this program. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Carolyn Robbins, distinguished authority on early American history and culture and retired professor from Bryn Mawr College. Dr. Robbins will speak from New Orleans, one of the world's gayest and most historic cities, an appropriate locale for her topic, the pursuit of happiness. New Orleans, along with New York and San Francisco, is generally recognized as one of America's few truly cosmopolitan cities. First the French and then the Spanish ruled New Orleans, and the combination of the two cultures, known as Creole, is seen everywhere. The French and Spanish buildings, with their famed iron-lace grille balconies, are a familiar sight in the Vieux Carré, or French Quarter, one of the most fascinating sections of any American city. The French Quarter was once a haven for pirates and smugglers, and one of the most famous streets here is still called Pirates Alley. Today, the area around Pirates Alley is the informal art center of New Orleans, similar to the Left Bank in Paris. Here, young artists ply their trade, offering the visitor everything from caricature to serious oil painting. Perhaps the most historic building in all New Orleans is the Cabildo, with its massive arches and wrought iron balconies. Built in 1795, the Cabildo was the home of the Spanish governors when that nation ruled the city. It is said that the famous pirate Jean Lafitte was once imprisoned here, and the Cabildo still houses many of his guns and swords. In 1803, when Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana territory from France, the official transfer of government was made here. Next door to the Cabildo, facing New Orleans' Jackson Square, stands St Louis Cathedral, one of America's most famous churches. The cathedral was built in 1794, when Spain ruled the city, and is still in use today. New Orleans is famed in literature for its streetcar named Desire, a streetcar that once traveled to the old city's Desire Street. Today, the streetcar named Desire is actually a bus, but some of the old streetcars that are part of the city's heritage still operate. Like San Francisco's cable cars, the streetcars in New Orleans were about to be retired, but a civic battle resulted in the preservation of a few lines. One of the lines passes in front of Gallier Hall, site of today's AEI lecture. Gallier Hall is nearly a century and a half old. It served as New Orleans City Hall until 1959. Inside Gallier Hall, Dr. Carolyn Robbins is discussing the pursuit of happiness. Dr. Robbins' best-known work is entitled The 18th Century Commonwealth Man, a significant study of the political philosophies of the period. But in this lecture, Dr. Robbins is drawing on a quite different document of historical significance.
When they asked me to talk, they suggested that perhaps I could do something out of my book. But you'll discover I've drawn on the intellectual background of the Declaration of Independence, but I have, both for reasons of time and for the particular interest I think it presents to us, selected two sentences, and in particular one phrase of that famous document for consideration tonight. Pursuit of happiness. This is a sermon. I shall re-examine familiar words and try to illuminate their meaning and significance at the time they were written and to the revolutionary generation whose thoughts they were intended to express. This may, in turn, suggest their continuing relevancy to ourselves, even though our times and circumstances are different. Words like books are not absolutely dead things contained in dictionaries and manipulated by word-mongers. They have a life and vitality of their own, and sometimes undergo astonishing transformations. If they recur in revered documents and are often repeated, they do not so much alter as accrue importance. Their analysis is perhaps one of the most valuable services celebrations like the bicentennial render. The Declaration of Independence was all-important as a statement of its signers' beliefs and of the country represented by them. The effect, ultimately, upon the British, to whom its indictment and intentions were directed, was far-reaching. It can also now, during our festivities and memorials, become freshly a part of the aspirations of this age, and remind us all of the ever-unfinished business of life and work in these United States. Here is my text. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable, Jefferson said unalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What did Thomas Jefferson mean? What was understood at the time by his words? John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Philip Livingston, and Roger Sherman were associated with him on the drafting committee, and after the Continental Congress had adopted the Declaration, were amongst the 56 Americans who signed it on or after the 4th of July, 1776, as it was publicly distributed. The phrases were felicitous and bold. The rights claimed were already dear to the colonists' hearts. The reasons listed for the dissolution of the political bands to Great Britain seemed valid. The indictment of George III, and by implication of his ministers and people, convincing. These were firmly persuasive to many. That others preferred the inconvenience of imperial control and the hardships of exile is also indisputably true. The loyalists were many, but with few exceptions, less articulate. But public opinion and action prompted by it are commonly determined by the vigorous and outspoken, helped greatly by the mistakes and misconceptions of their opponents. The British government and people at large seemed, during the critical years after 1763, singularly unable to recognize the significance of what was happening overseas, and, with some few but notable exceptions, altogether misunderstanding of the American political stance. The course of events, the changing circumstance of both mother country and those who had left her for the New World, must be carefully scrutinized to estimate the total situation. The subject now being discussed does not include description or analysis of what led to rupture in 1776. Thus, it's only a part of the seamless robe of history. Confined to the quoted text, the topic here concerns intellectual cross-currents, and in particular their relation to the 18th century's conception of happiness, and the meaning Jefferson probably attached to it. Jefferson, for he and not his distinguished colleagues of the committee nor Congress, was chiefly responsible for the Declaration. His draft was amended, to be sure, some few words and phrases changed or omitted, and an important section, that on slavery, left out. But all testimony witnesses to the Virginians' overall authorship of the document and selection of the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In so doing, Jefferson altered the more familiar trinity of life, liberty, and property, or estates. Bills of Rights published with the new states' constitutions, drawn up after independence was declared, often made use of the earlier form, adding to it, as in Pennsylvania, for example, the promotion of safety and happiness, or some similar statement about the aims of government. Before listing others who had employed the phrase pursuit of happiness in one or another context, examining some variations in the meaning and motivation the 18th century attributed to the search for private and public felicity, and analysing Jefferson's own position, a word is in order on the traditional trio. The right to life seems obvious. Even Thomas Hobbes, in the Leviathan, a polemic setting forth the necessity for a sovereign power in the state, conceded the subject the right to defend his own person against assault. But I'd like to point out that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the matter of life was discussed in yet other contexts. The use of torture was widely questioned and abolished by some European rulers. Capital punishment for many of the offences for which it was then the penalty was questioned, even condemned. Three famous men, Voltaire, dramatist, novelist, historian, you all know him, John Howard, Quaker Sheriff of Bedford, an author of a much-read examination of Western prisons, and Beccaria, the Italian Marquis, who wrote on crimes and punishments, were enormously influential in Europe and America. My janitor the other day asked me if I knew anything on capital punishment, and I gave him a paperback, Beccaria, and he got A in the evening course he was doing because he'd read it. He didn't tell where he got it from. I was much pleased that he read it with such interest. It's still the best thing on the subject, of course, although it's 1764 when it was written. Prussia, for example, modified her penal code. Virginia and Pennsylvania effected considerable changes in the practice of penology and redistribution by their states for offences committed. I'm not claiming that Jefferson, in placing life first, was consciously behaving in any but the conventional manner of all opponents of tyranny, but I'm suggesting here and in passing that in the period of the American Revolution, the new constitutions and laws then adopted, life, its treatment and disposal were becoming an issue of deeper consequence than the mere matter of existence or of self-defense. Liberty, second of the three, has meant different things to various generations and associations of men, applying in some ages only to the privilege of a ruling elite or the members of an established religion. More extensively, as used in the Declaration, it could be cited as an assertion of resistance rights, the right to experiment and change the form of government under which one lived, redefinition of professed creeds, alteration of ancient ceremony and church service. Freedom in these matters was often discussed. Ancient civil and religious establishments were, in the 16th and 17th centuries, overthrown, and authority of all sorts questioned. With the invention of printing, the presses could pour forth to an increasingly literate public propaganda about rights, claims, and novelties asserted. For Jefferson and the American colonists, the meaning of liberty was threefold: the right to rebel against a government believed to be tyrannical and unjust, the right to worship freely in a church of the individual's choice, and the right to devise a government to secure the newly acquired freedom. In all steps taken and in all decisions about them, this third right assumed that the people were always a party to decisions made. Independence, of course, came by throwing off the British yoke, by actions that, before their successful issue was assured, could be called rebellious. Liberty was thus essential to the cause of independence and, according to John Locke, the English philosopher that Jefferson admired so much, to happiness. The natural right to liberty made the people's activity legitimate. The tree of liberty, Jefferson wrote, must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Even in less troubled times, a mild riot or a rising had a medicinal effect, he thought, writing at the time of Daniel Shays' rebellion in 1786 in Massachusetts. Resistance to any government failing to meet the needs of the contemporary world could be justified. Constitutions should not be regarded as perpetual and unalterable. Each generation might well find due cause for change and amendment. Jefferson despised what he called looking backwards and studying musty records. Of course, it's therefore doubtful whether he would like what we're doing now, I don't know. Men gave up eating acorns primitive savages had devoured, forsook obsolete weapons like bows and arrows when better were invented, and discarded those garments like fig leaves that were useful in the Garden of Eden, or those that had fitted him when he was a boy. The earth, he wrote to James Madison, belongs to the living. Jefferson, who is the author of the phrase I'm talking about tonight, was probably the most revolutionary of the founding fathers. Many of the things he said would probably not have been agreed to by, for instance, John Jay or Alexander Hamilton. A majority of citizens, acting directly and personally, could draw up those rules they felt suited to their needs. In America, when the Confederacy formed after independence seemed insufficient for the needs of a new nation, a convention was called and another constitution created. Jefferson watched the progress of debates in 1787 from his position abroad. On the whole, he welcomed the republic as then devised, though he criticized the failure, soon repaired by the amendments of 1789, to frame at the time a Bill of Rights, and he regretted the absence of limitation on presidential tenure. This is all an old story to you, of course, but serves to show that the revolutionary of 1776 continued to defend the right to change, to adapt government to the demands of the passing years. Some further amendments in the course of history would no doubt have pleased Jefferson, particularly perhaps those about the widening franchise and the extension of civil rights. Possibly he would have wished for even more. In any case, he was always interested in the participation of the people in government on as wide a basis as possible. A natural aristocracy of talent might, he believed, emerge, but that should be a matter of choice and selection, not of inherited wealth or status. The right to liberty also implied religious freedom. On his tombstone, you'll remember, Jefferson wanted his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, the establishment of the University of Virginia, and the Act for Establishing Religious Liberty in his native state memorialized. He had drawn up in 1779 a bill for religious liberty, which aroused some opposition at the time in the Assembly, but with minor alterations passed in 1786. The Act was then printed in both English and French and widely distributed at home and abroad. An old gardener in Brand Hollis's estate in Essex, Brand Hollis was a friend to America, when John Adams visited him there not very long after the passage of the Act, spoke to the American guest of his admiration for the Virginian Act and the liberty it allowed. I take it the gardener was a dissenter from the Church of England. Jefferson believed that difference of opinion was advantageous, deplored uniformity and inflexibility. Without divergence from the orthodox or heresies he maintained, neither Christianity nor the discoveries of Galileo could have been accepted. God had created the mind free to influence its processes by temporal punishment, and civil incapacitation could only result in hypocrisy. The legitimate way to recruit for church membership or new ideologies of any kind was by reason and persuasion. Men should not be obliged to contribute towards the propagation of creeds or upkeep of services, the establishment of denominations whose opinions they did not share.
We're listening to Dr. Caroline Robbins discussing the pursuit of happiness from Gallier Hall in New Orleans. Dr. Robbins has been examining the meaning of the pursuit of happiness in the context of the Declaration of Independence. In just one moment, she will continue. For over 200 years, the Mississippi River has been the main lifeline of New Orleans, and that remains true today. The first steamboat arrived from Pittsburgh in 1812, and that event marked the beginning of the city's greatest era. New Orleans became the distribution point for all manner of goods from the Midwest, the East, and other parts of the South. Today, New Orleans remains the nation's second-ranking port city. In addition to commerce, the Mississippi plays an important part in New Orleans' recreational life. The banks of the river are crowded by both residents and visitors almost all year round in New Orleans' warm climate. It's all a part of the pursuit of happiness in New Orleans, which is the subject of today's AER lecturer, Dr. Caroline Robbins.
To turn now to the third of the traditional trinity, property, for which Jefferson substituted the pursuit of happiness. We at once discover one of those word changes affecting meaning to which I referred earlier. In the 17th century, property was often written propriety, which of course we use in a different connection altogether, a term often carrying with its use much wider implications than estates and possessions. Property and propriety were used separately and together, often for the same things, indiscriminately, though the latter perhaps more generally in a comprehensive sense. There is a thing called property, or propriety, that the people of England are fondest of. George Villiers, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, declared in the House of Lords, 1675, using his statement as an argument for indulgence to the much harassed Protestant dissenters. conscience being the property of all serious men. Richard Baxter, a noted Presbyterian author and divine, wrote of propriety as naturally antecedent to government, which doth not give it, but regulate it for the common good, and went on to say that men's lives and liberties were the chief part of their propriety. John Locke, writing only a little later whom Jefferson thought the greatest of all philosophers, writing only a little later in the two treatises of government, was careful to explain that he called by the general name property the preservation of lives, liberties, and estates, all in short that a man owned in his person. The philosopher used both spellings. The magic formula, life, liberty, and property, is thus, it seems, repetitious. Each part could be taken to include the others. Not that Americans were by any means indifferent to property or their right to it. Jefferson defended the more literal significance of property in the detailed indictment of the king in the facts he submitted to a candid world in the Declaration. Among other illegal practices, he listed infringements upon American estates by taxation without representation, at least of any kind recognized by the colonists in the British Parliament, and the forced collection of dues and duties. Property had been threatened by cutting off of trade, the erection of a multitude of new offices, the station of troops in peacetime to eke out our substance, as well as by those stamp and tea taxes which had caused so much furor. The immediate occasion of friction between American and Britain was the claim of the legislature at Westminster to obtain revenue from the colonies. The crimes committed were thus spelled out in the Declaration. But in substituting the pursuit of happiness for property, Jefferson had probably in mind the right to larger aspirations than those expressed in defiance of unwarranted taxation. My text includes the statement that all men are created equal, but I'm not going to dwell on this. It was by no means the first expression of its kind. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, was a question revealing constant aspirations in the hearts of the oppressed or downtrodden. And equality before the Almighty was also recalled from time to time, though implementation was but seldom attempted in this world. An assertion of equality for the poorest he, as he turns up in an English debate on occasion, is difficult to translate into 20th century terms. Cecilia Kenyon, perhaps our most learned political scientist, has suggested that the phrase pursuit of happiness reveals an egalitarianism in Jefferson. I'm not sure that I agree. He certainly believed that as many as feasible should have an equal opportunity to work, seek happiness, and exercise their political rights. He himself helped to get rid of legal customs like primogeniture and entail, that is, testamentary procedures, which resulted in the accumulation of estates in the hands of eldest son and heir. He's known to have preferred a society composed of landholders, not markedly disparate in wealth, and is often reproached with unrealistically seeing this agrarian utopia as better than the foreseeable developments of a moneyed economy. Possibly later economic revolutions would have modified his view, but in the present connection, neither the equality he believed in or other conceptions of it held by his contemporaries can be readily expressed in modern terms. I've just finished reading a book by Richard Morris, who teaches at Columbia, very distinguished historian. It's called Seven Who Shaped Our Destiny, and I recommend it to you all, especially for reading aloud, because it's short sketches of great men. And at the end, which I only finished yesterday, he's talking about the Founding Fathers and equality, and what he says about their views, equality of opportunity for all except slaves, of course, in that benighted age. Equality of opportunity, he emphasizes. But he said they had no idea of modern demands for equality of results, expressed in quota of sex, age, and race. And this is a better expression, really, than what I've gone on to say here, that in the modern, far greater government activity, not to mention the procedures of giant industrial and commercial corporations, play a role. Socialism, communism, paternalism, or civil rights movements each have different ways to propose to bring about equality, none dreamed of in the 18th century. life, liberty, and property, even happiness, as I hope to show, presents much of more relevancy to ourselves and our property. And that isn't to say that I think the problem of equality isn't a very important one for us to study, but it's too difficult for me to take care of in a few short sentences in this superficial paper. When I began these inquiries into the use and meaning of the phrase pursuit of happiness, I questioned my friends and searched more learned authorities than myself. A colleague immediately declared the phrase was merely a formal way of stating that Americans in the new world of opportunity had a greater chance of happiness than most other people. A chance, that is, once they had rid themselves of the tyranny of the wicked English. More portentously, another said it was obvious that everyone wanted to be happy. In 1776, the Puritans were already outnumbered, and it was therefore acceptable to say so, to say that you wanted to be happy. A scholar of great erudition reminded me that during the preceding century, the hedonist tradition, the doctrine taught by Epicurus in the 3rd century before Christ, pleasure was the chief good, was enjoying a vigorous revival. Another suggested had an inalienable right to be happy as all the rest. Cautious philosophers supposed that since a considerable number of volumes had, over the past decades, variously discussed happiness and its connection with truth, beauty, virtue, and the good state, the matter was in the air and almost inevitably found a place along with other rights claimed. Amongst the learned authorities studied, 2 learned articles on our subject by Ganter in the William and Mary Quarterly were useful and stimulating. The author, who's also drawn on Chinard's studies of Jefferson's reading, tracked down earlier uses of the phrase on happiness. There were many. The citations noticed usually occurred in discussions of the motivation of life and politics, that is to say, not in connection with life and liberty, or as the pursuit of happiness, one connection or another. Locke, in his famous essay, emphasized a determination to seek happiness, the foundation of liberty. Paxton, writing, he's a doctor who wrote some tracts in civil polity, wrote of the pursuit as inseparable from the nature of man. Many others thereafter referred to it in similar or identical mode. Most were apparently moderately optimistic about the results of the quest. But Pascal, in his Pensées, and Bishop Joseph Butler, author of the Analogy of Religion, famous and admirable work of religion, but it was Butler who suggested sending a bishop to America, you'll remember, and caused a good deal of fuss. They were not optimistic. Pascal felt that happiness would only be found in the next world. Butler, that here all that could be hoped for was a mitigation of misery. Cantor and Chinard explored the influence of some of the natural rights school men like Jean-Jay Burlamachi, Jefferson's contemporaries Richard Bland and James Wilson, Virginian and Scotsman respectively. Anybody who wishes to delve more deeply into the political theories of the Revolutionary period should investigate the suggestions these and others have made. Most profitable, for the beginner possibly, would be works by Rossiter, Seed Time of the Republic, a new volume the Library of Congress has brought out called The Fundamental Testaments of the American Revolution, very cheap too, only $3.50, containing Miss Kenyon's paper on the Declaration of Independence, and the many essays contained in a paperback called The Reinterpretation of the American Revolution, which Jack Green edited. There was probably no time when most thoughtful people would have denied man's overwhelming desire for happiness, or would not have agreed that governments should seek to ensure what measure of it they thought possible in time and circumstance. That is to say, of course, rulers commonly claimed to provide predominance of pleasure over pain in some sense or another for those they governed. Interpretation of what constituted this for the people at large might differ greatly. The best and most admired state might well be, as Alton and Sidney believed, that which best provides for war, the people presumably profiting in the long run by victory. The Republican martyr for the good old cause of liberty against tyranny was thinking of security, but it's significant of the period that in this chapter of his discourses, though he pays tribute to increase of population, strength, and wealth, he feels that that which does not enlarge, in other words, that nation which doesn't conquer some others, is useless. Authoritarians like Jean Baudin, Frenchman, believed that only under an all-powerful sovereign could that happiness he admitted to be the end of government be achieved. Others, at certain times, felt a forced conversion to what they conceived of as the true faith, best for the ultimate felicity of their own subjects or even for those of other countries. Mohammedan and Christian fought holy wars. Hostilities were also undertaken for the announced purpose of the prevention or obstruction of aggression. For the honour of the realm, governments were obliged to maintain honour, security, and prosperity. How they were to do this was not a matter of general agreement. "'Tis true,' wrote William Penn, his first frame of government, "men seem to agree in the end, that is, of government, but in the means they differ. As to divine, so to this human felicity, and the cause is much the same, not always want of light and knowledge, but want of using them rightly." Controversy raged in the 16th and 17th century over the form and power of government. Even the natural rights school, and I won't list you all their names, people like Grotius, the Dutchman, who wrote on War and Peace, after paying an almost pro forma tribute to happiness, concentrated on individual privilege, military forces, juridical processes, corrupt or inefficient administration, international relations, and, of course, the kind of constitution which made for good government. Nor was this irrelevant, I hasten to add, but like Fontenelle, the learned French virtuoso, in his essay on Du Bonheur, I find the matter of happiness frequently mentioned but seldom really analysed. One example will illustrate this point. After the Revolution of 1688, Englishmen and their European contemporaries thought of Britain as singularly blessed with a constitution ensuring the rights of the people and presumably their happiness. A movement underway was for the foundation of charity schools, all sorts of sermons about charity schools to raise money for them. And there were a lot of pamphlets, some for, some against. And almost the only person who ever suggested that it might make a poor person happier to know how to read and write was Dr. Isaac Watts, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Pursuit of happiness of this kind did not loom very large in the visions of politicians and social reformers, nor did they often talk of greater public happiness as the end of their labours. But between the two tumultuous decades of mid-17th century England and the American Revolution, a considerable literature was produced on various kinds of happiness, not directed necessarily to social reform, but simply on happiness as such. And these eventually began to influence statesmanship. One reason for them has already been mentioned, a revival in the reading of Stoic and Epicurean classics. Another was a change in theological assumptions and mores. The virtues of asceticism were less stressed. Classification of these works relating to happiness, if accurate, would be manifold, but they can be roughly divided into those attributing human motivation solely to man's self-interest, his wish to avoid pain and enjoy pleasure, and on the other hand, those who saw men as benevolent, aware that in the happiness of others his own right might be found, and that in the practice of virtue, appreciation of beauty and truth lay the path to felicity. There were treatises in both categories. I have a little shelf of them, I've collected them, called Virtue and Happiness, Happiness and Virtue, an Inquiry into the Nature of Virtue and Happiness, and so on. And they give me a lot of pleasure, but sometimes they're quite confusing. There were treatises in both categories that dwelt only on the individual, but in both can also be found attempts to examine the effects of private hedonism upon the commonwealth, as well as on the connection of the individual with the public welfare. In seeking out these books on virtue and happiness, beauty and truth, it's not always easy to guess whether the title implies a political philosophy or an aesthetic approach. And you can just take your chances when you pull a shelf called Virtue and Happiness, a book from the shelf, as to which it's going to do. The work of Hobbes stressed man's selfishness. Nasty and brutish in a state of nature, each warring for his own interests, man sought in society to prevent others harming or molesting him, and was prepared to ensure safety and happiness to cede absolute power to a sovereign. The ruler's duty was thus largely that of protector and umpire from enemies abroad and hostile attackers at home. Mandeville, in a book, famous, notorious book, The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Benefits, also believed the individual only intent on his own felicity. he shocked his many readers by declaring that such egotism and self-indulgence might even be looked on as contributing towards the common weal. Trade would prosper, luxury goods would make their manufacturers rich, increased profits in general might bring more employment and greater wealth to community. Arguments not entirely discarded today, I think.
From Gallier Hall in New Orleans, Dr. Carolyn Robbins has been discussing how the phrase "the pursuit of happiness" relates to the American revolutionary tradition in the Declaration of Independence. In just one moment, Dr. Robbins will continue. Jackson Square, in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, is named for Andrew Jackson, who defeated a British expeditionary force in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Jackson rounded up a motley army composed of Tennessee and Kentucky militiamen, the New Orleans garrison, and Jean Lafitte's pirate crew, and faced a well-trained British force which outnumbered Jackson's men by 2-1. In defeating the British, Jackson lost 71 men, while the British lost 2,000. Ironically, the battle was fought several days after the war had ended, but because of poor communications, neither side got the word. Today, New Orleans is a major center of communications. The word for today's AE lecture is happiness. Dr. Caroline Robbins continues her discussion.
This tie between virtue and its rewards and effects, public happiness and morality, was frequently discussed, and its bibliography lists a confusingly similar array of titles. Amongst these, 3 important works, however, must be mentioned, and they're ones I know that Jefferson studied. Richard Cumberland, Bishop of Peterborough in the 17th century, wrote in the Laws of Nature a refutation of Hobbes, which is a bestseller in Latin and in English. The major end of the state must be, he argued, the well-being and happiness of the majority of the members composing it. The good bishop thus anticipated the famous phrase coined later as defining the criterion of good government. This phrase, the greatest good of the greatest number, appeared first in an inquiry into the original of our ideas of beauty and virtue, London 1725, by the famous Scots-Irish professor of moral philosophy, Francis Hutcheson. An inquiry written in Ireland went into 5 18th century editions, was translated into French and German, and exerted almost as much influence as Hutcheson, the philosopher's compend and system of moral philosophy. Published after the author had taught enthusiastic classes at Glasgow and increased the already wide range of his influence. Continuing and enriching their tradition, he was a disciple both of Cumberland and of Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose characteristics proclaimed the best of good society as being found in the general happiness of its members. Cumberland, Shaftesbury, and Hutcheson saw in the conscience, or the moral sense, as the latter two were to designate it, the origin of man's motivation in selecting the virtuous rather than the bad action. In the sympathy of this moral sense was found all that made association viable. That which all want is that which will bring about the felicity of the majority. Shaftesbury saw an almost universal, if at times only latent, benevolence inherent in human nature. You see, he's at the other extreme from Hobbes. This would be even more apparent when artificial restriction upon civil and religious liberty were removed and freedom from ignorance and superstition was achieved. Then, the Earl was convinced, virtue and happiness would everywhere prevail. Quote, "To love the public, to study universal good, to promote the interest of the whole as lies within our power, is surely the height of goodness, and makes that temper which we call divine." Jefferson evidently read Shaftesbury with care. Influence of the characteristics is often obvious. He took notes on the Earl's ideas about toleration. He echoes his emphasis on good humour, on ridicule as a test of truth, as well as on utility, that is the greatest good of the greatest number, as the criterion of virtue. From Shaftesbury, Hutcheson had, as noticed, drawn much, and he in turn affected the philosophies of Beccaria, Joseph Priestley, chemist who is thought to have discovered oxygen and lived in Pennsylvania for a while in his latter years, and Jeremy Bentham, at the very least in their adoption of the formula of the greatest happiness principle. This was, of course, to be the catchword of the English utilitarians. By the principle of utility, Bentham, their earliest protagonist, meant that which approves or disapproves of every action, personal or communal, as it produces private or public benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, and obversely prevents the happening of pain and unhappiness. It should be noted that though, like this formula or definition, many of the radical reforms advocated by the utilitarians stemmed from their precursors, the natural rights political philosophers, the utilitarians depart completely from the earlier school in rejecting those natural rights that we hear so much about, of course, in the Declaration itself, independence. Let me illustrate. Bentham, in early and middle life, a passionate believer in the emancipation of all colonies from imperial control, considered what he called the new nation, that is, the United States, perhaps the most enlightened in the globe. But he regretted that the American founders had seen fit in national and state declarations, and he means the Declaration of Institution, and Independence and constitutions, to justify their excellent cause by reasons so much fitter to beget objections than to remove them. 1776, in fact, represents an important date in developing ideologies. In that year appeared a fragment on government by Bentham, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, advocating that freedom of trade Jefferson had claimed in a summer review 2 years before, and Common Sense by Thomas Paine, as well as the Declaration of Independence. In all these documents, the greatest happiness was a fundamental assumption, but all did not proclaim that faith in natural rights which had so strongly pervaded earlier political manifestos and in which Americans so firmly believed. In the last year of his life, Jefferson was to call the Declaration the genuine effusion of the souls of American society. He explained to Henry Lee in 1825, when he sat down in Philadelphia in 1776 to draft it, clearly defined objectives. These were not to find out new principles or new arguments, never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject, in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take, neither aiming at originality of principle or sentiment, nor yet copied from any particular and previous writing. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. Jefferson's mind was richly furnished with recollections of the literature of the past century that he had read so carefully, particularly with that part of it devoted to politics and philosophy, public spirit, virtue, and happiness. The reading he recommended to the attention of the university, of which he justly claimed to be the father, some advice about books he sent correspondence, those notes and commonplaces books that she now studied for us, all throw light on this reading. In them will be found nearly all the themes referred to here, and many more there's no time to detail. From these, but much also, I think, from the circumstance of the age into which he was born, he developed a belief in natural inalienable rights, only fully enjoyed by men living in a free state. In a republic, the happiness of the people was the prime concern. On achievement of this, citizens were able to exert their due influence in public affairs. In its largest sense, the pursuit of happiness was an endeavor for the welfare of all Americans.
We are listening to Dr. Caroline Robbins discussing the meaning of the phrase the pursuit of happiness as it applied to the Declaration of Independence in revolutionary times and as it applies to our lives today. In just one moment, Dr. Robbins will continue. One of the main attractions in New Orleans' French Quarter is the Fontainebleau Apartments. The apartments are a series of buildings built over 150 years ago, and they are still occupied today. No other apartment buildings in the United States have been in continuous use for so long a time. The apartments are a part of the historic row of buildings that face Jackson Square. In another historic New Orleans building, Gallier Hall, our AEI lecturer, Dr. Caroline Robbins, is concluding her address on the pursuit of happiness.
Jefferson's remarks about happiness throughout his life are illuminating, though he could not be blamed for wishing a fuller expression of his political philosophy. Of course, like the rest of us, he was not always thinking of public happiness. He wrote his daughter Martha not to be idle, like many another father, and said she wouldn't be happy if she was indolent. In their correspondence, he and John Adams discussed personal troubles and amusements. They expressed a wish for good health and preoccupied with families. discussing whether they would live their lives over again. They recollected the stirring times in which they had begun their careers. In wishing friends happiness, Jefferson, of course, meant personal success, enjoyment, absence of misfortune. His own private felicities were derived from study, music, projects, and family. But in approaching the subject of happiness in a less personal way, the interpretation is different. Each and every American, of course, wanted to avoid discomfort and obtain pleasure, but the pursuit in the Declaration, I think, implies more. Happiness should be the concern of citizens and of the officials they elected to serve their interest. Happiness meant public happiness. That cannot be too greatly stressed. Different societies and communities might, it was true, value some ways and conditions more than others, but the greatest happiness principle would afford the criterion. The only orthodox object of the institution of government is to secure the greatest degree of happiness possible to the general mass of those associated with it. Taking office, ministers were entrusted with the care of public happiness. The equal rights of man and the happiness of individuals were, he wrote, late in life, the only legitimate objects of government. Government should be wise and frugal, restraining men from doing injury to others, free to regulate certain mutual affairs. A good government was essential to close the circle of our felicity. Of course, he was chosen to write the Declaration because he wrote well, and he did. Public happiness was achieved by the satisfaction of the aspiration of the majority of the people living together. It could not be attained by each consulting only self-interest, but to it all must contribute. The general sum of enjoyment was what counted. The individual search for truth and success, while valuable, were not in themselves sufficient. Effort by all was obligatory. To be good-humoured rather than censorious was wise. Harmony and affection should prevail. Union was especially necessary in government. Minorities must be tenderly treated, their rights respected, but the will of the majority must be supreme. The American Republic will secure liberty and thus promote happiness. In such a realm, only could the will of everyone find expression. Only in it, therefore, could happiness be pursued and men live and die content. All virtuous endeavour therein was directed towards the care of the people's happiness. Now, the men of Jefferson's generation were very public-spirited in many cases, but he was well aware that that some men needed more instruction in virtue and in social duty than others. The moral sense or conscience with which all were endowed, when active, led to right action, but frequently needed informing about the road to happiness and the identity of the individual welfare with the public good. Writing to Thomas Law in 1814, Jefferson argued the case for man's moral sense and its relation to his role in society and the pursuit of happiness. Morality, he said, was found less in the love of God or the search for knowledge than in our relations with others as constituting the boundaries of morality. Strictly speaking, a man can owe no duty, he said to himself, obligation requiring two parties. Self-love was an element in morality, and indeed it was the chief antagonist of virtue. Jefferson went on to express disagreement with the fallacy of self-interest propounded by Helvetius, and he maintained the moral sense of man prompted him to good and social works. And where the response wasn't immediate, then he was to be made to realize his reputation and therefore his happiness with the people he was living must depend on his working for the common good. Jefferson was a great student of Hume, the Scotch philosopher, who compared Helvetius's self-interest with the benevolent theories of Hutcheson and Shaftesbury, and Jefferson comes nearer, of course, to the benevolence of Shaftesbury by a long shot than Kames. But Kames nevertheless conceded, and Jefferson quotes him in one of his essays, one of his letters, benevolence is applied not to individuals, but to one great whole, the country, its government, its religion, all becoming objects of public spirit. I began by saying that this was a sermon with a text from the Declaration whose bicentennial we're celebrating. I proceeded as teachers and preachers do, with perhaps more detail than you wanted or expected, to discuss what the author of the Declaration had in mind, and, as he grew older, considering contemporary problems. The moral surely relies in reflecting yet more profoundly than I have been able to dwell here upon the public good, the ways in which our own happiness depends upon a true understanding of the general welfare. True godliness, William Penn said, does not turn men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it. Ezra Pound, you remember, said, you never know unless you happen yourself personally to care. That is, you never know what you should do. What is good for this or that corporation, as we've been reminded one time or another, or this or another gifted individual, is often stated to be good for the country. Surely it's more accurate and perceptive to appreciate the fact that what is best for the United States is best for all who live within them. That is the pursuit of happiness to which we should all rededicate ourselves at this time.
We've been listening to Dr. Caroline Robbins discussing the pursuit of happiness. Dr. Robbins described her lecture as a sermon based upon the text of the Declaration of Independence. This lecture has been one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute on the goals and achievements of the American Revolution and how this still applies to our lives today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Robbins' lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute, that's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.